John Gill and the philosophers on hell. Start out, he says, the rest of the dead, the wicked who live not till the 1,000 years are ended, he's premillennial, and then they will live being raised from the dead, even all the wicked that have been from the beginning of the world. I think this is interesting. He says, and these rising where they died and were buried will be in and come from 4 quarters of the world. Hell and the grave will make no change in them, and they will rise with the same malicious and revengeful spirit. In his next section on the body of divinity, he says, when the judgment is finished and the sentence pronounced, the wicked will go into everlasting punishment. And he first wants to prove that there will be a state of punishment in the future for wicked men. He talks about first there's a punishment in their souls first, and he gives an example of the parable of the rich man, but then there's a punishment of them in soul and body after the resurrection and the last judgment. He describes it as a continuation and perfection of the former. And he starts off the whole proof, as he does in many areas, but we can see this evidence from the light of nature among the heathens. He shows how it is their view and it is spoken of not only by their poets, but by their philosophers. The poets indeed say many fabulous things of Pluto, the king of hell, and others as judges there. How they talk about the infernal rivers, yet under these fables some truth lies disguised. He says that the early church father Tertullian charges the heathens with borrowing these things from the sacred writings. He says when we as Christians, we speak of God as a judge, and we speak of a place of eternal fire for those who do not turn to God, he says that we are laughed at. And he's saying from the light of nature, these heathens and these philosophers, these poets, they erect a tribunal in hell and speak of a river of fire there, from whence, says he, I beseech you, have they such like things, but from our mysteries. And it's not the poets only, but the more serious and wiser sort of heathens. He says many of the philosophers wrote of things done in Hades or hell, and one of the greatest, Plato, denies that death is the last thing, but that the punishments of hell are the last. And he declares them to be rational and not fables. Gill says Arnobius, an ancient defender of the Christians against the heathens, says, dare ye deride us when we speak of hell and of unquenchable fire? He says that into which we know souls are cast. Does not your Plato say the same in his book of the immortality of the soul? Does he not make mention of the rivers where souls are rolled, plunged, and burnt? He points to some of the Stoics who taught that the godly and ungodly will have different habitations, one delightful and one uncomfortable. He points to some of the Pythagorean and Platonic philosophers who speak of punishments in hell. He says a state of punishment hereafter appears from the impressions of guilt and wrath on the consciences of men now for sins committed, being struck with the fear of future judgment and of punishment that shall follow. And he says, and this is observed in the heathens themselves, their consciences also accusing them. He points to Cicero, who says, every man's sin distresses him, their evil thoughts and consciences terrify them. These, to the ungodly, are their daily and domestic furies, which haunt them day and night. Gill says, this may be argued from the justice of God. If there is a God, he must be believed to be just, and if there is a just God, there must be a future state of punishment. He says, it is certain when looking at the world around us that justice does not take place here and now. He says, it seems, therefore, but just and reasonable that there should be a change of things in a future state when the saints will be comforted and the wicked tormented. He says, it is but a righteous thing with God to render tribulation to wicked men hereafter, who have had their flow of worldly happiness and abused it. He says this is abundantly evident from the divine revelation from the Old and New Testaments. He gives evidence that it will always continue and never have an end, and is therefore called everlasting punishment and everlasting destruction. Gill says, and this will admit of proof from both reason and revelation, from the light of nature and from the sure word of prophecy. He says the heathens had not only knowledge of the future punishment of the wicked in hell, but of the eternal duration of it. Gill points to an Epicurean philosopher who many years before the coming of Christ and the writings of the New Testament says that the fears of eternal punishment after death and as what would never have an end were the cause of all the troubles and miseries of human life. He says, under the bondage of which men lay oppressed, until Epicurus, a man of Greece, rose up and delivered men from those fears and fancies, so that according to him, Gill says, till the time of Epicurus, who lived more than 200 years before Christ, this sentiment has always obtained among the heathens. And this can also be proved from its opposite of eternal punishment would be eternal happiness. Gill writes, from the light of nature and reason, for though the kind of happiness is not to be discovered and demonstrated by it, yet some general notions of future happiness may be evidenced from it. A general notion of happiness after death has obtained among the wiser sort of heathens. And he points to the Elysian fields and islands of the blessed as the seat and habitation of pious persons after death. They describe this as grassy plains and flowery meads and as abounding with all manner of delicious fruits. And they described it as in a most temperate climate, free of all wintry weather and blistering storms and scorching heat. Described it with flowing fountains and purling streams. Brings up Tertullian again, as he thinks that they have borrowed these from the sacred writings. Gill says, but those things are not only said by their poets, but by their wise and grave philosophers, as Plato, Plutarch, Seneca, and others. Gill shows that we can prove this from a natural desire in mankind after happiness, in which is universal, and yet it is certain it is not attained in this present life, though eagerly sought for in one way or another. Some seek for it in natural wisdom and knowledge, some in wealth and riches, others in the honors of the world and fame and popular applause, and others in the gratification of sensual appetites and lusts, but is never found to satisfaction in either. And then he points to the book of Ecclesiastes, and he says, this is only found in God, the chiefest good, and that not to perfection in this life. Now, either this desire of happiness is implanted in vain, which is not reasonable to suppose, or there must be a future state in which this happiness will be enjoyed. And then he points to the resurrection, and not before will be completely happy to full satisfaction, even when they shall awake in the likeness of God.